Folks, we've got a ton of stuff to talk about today. Some of it's going to be good, some of it will be bad, but first things first, it's very important that you all know going into this video that this preview of Forza Motorsport was just that, a preview of the game with only a handful of things to do. I did just about everything I could, and we're going to discuss all of it. Let's start with that steering animation though. It's no longer locked to 90 degrees in either direction and can now rotate up to 360 degrees total, which is fantastic. Now, obviously it's not the full 900 or so that most road cars get, but in a track race setting, you're never going to need to rotate the wheel beyond that unless you're drifting or recovering from a crash. So I think for 95% of situations, this new animation is perfectly fine and stops people from seeing speedy hands when you do have fully animated rotation on a gamepad. For comparison, GT7 also has 360 degrees of rotation. So I'd say starting off on a good note. This was literally the first thing I tested in game. Now let's talk a bit about just what this preview was and what we could do in it. This was an Xbox preview, meaning that none of us played on PC, which is certainly a bummer for me as I always play Forza on PC, but I do have an Xbox just for times like this, so all the footage you'll see today is captured on a Series S, and most of it is in the 60 FPS performance mode, but I will show off the graphics mode as well later in the video. Of course, if you do want to see Series X footage, I'm sure a lot of my fellow creators will be happy to provide that for you. So, we were able to play the intro sequence of the game, which has us driving both of the cover cars. We drove the Corvette E-Ray through Maple Valley first, and then I got a couple of laps in the Cadillac V-Series.R around Hakone. And of course, they had to drop that bump start on us. Now, we could only drive those cars and tracks once because, well, it's the intro sequence. But after that, we're given the option to customize our character a bit with a lot of racing suits to pick from there at the start, and then we're thrown into the main menu with one option available to us: race. And this is where we had access to the Builders Cup introduction, a single 3-event series with 3 B-class cars to pick from: an S209 STI, Civic Type R, and Mustang GT, all front or rear wheel drive. I went with the Subaru on my first run. Throughout this intro series, we're given access to 3 tracks to race on: the short layout of Grand Oak, which is a new custom track built for motorsport. Then we head to Mugello for another race on the short layout. And finally, the series finishes at Kyalami, where we do get to drive the full track. So a total of 5 cars on 5 tracks in the preview, with 3 of each of those being repeatable as much as we wanted by restarting the series. I played on both a gamepad as well as a wheel, the Thrustmaster TX with TLCM pedals. And I think we should talk about the driving experience on both of these first. This is, after all, the most important aspect of the game to me. After so much talk about the improved tire model and suspension and higher physics polling rate and super accurate track modeling, well, it's time to see if it all paid off. Overall, irrespective of input device, the game's handling feels great. It's a glaringly obvious improvement over FM7 while still managing to straddle that sim-light approach really well. The handling feels more accurate and more realistic, while also being easier to drive. Motorsport 7 always kind of felt like it was struggling with trying to be more hardcore sim, but without the detail and accuracy needed for that, and it made for a handling model that I didn't enjoy. In contrast, the new Motorsport finally drives like I think Motorsport should, close enough to the real-life experience with a lot of similar behaviors and a detailed simulation, but with some of the edges smoothed off and a more accessible approach. Of course, the major comparison here would be GT7, and there are some aspects I really like about GT7's handling, but Motorsport does handle some things better too. If you want to dive into the simness of the game, GT7 does have better management of things like fuel mixture and adjustable traction control, and has really good rain physics and a great out-of-the-box wheel feel. But Motorsport's braking feels amazing, rear-wheel drive feels really good, and things like body roll and chassis flex feel more accurate, and I find the controller experience to be a lot more enjoyable there too. Unfortunately, I didn't get to drive in the rain at all in the preview, so jury's still out on that one. So let's talk about how the game feels on a controller, and I've got really nothing but good things to say here. You know Forza Horizon and Motorsport have always been strong on gamepads. They know that's what the majority of their player base uses, and Motorsport 8 here is no exception. Gamepads feel better than they ever have. You do still have the minor quirks you'd expect from controlling a car in a sim with a joystick, and I did have to be pretty careful with throttle and steering input on some corners in the Civic, for example. You know, it's hard to be as smooth on a gamepad as you would be with a wheel, but the game translates those minor corrections and less precise inputs easily, and the gamepad still feels really responsive without feeling like you're always driving on the knife's edge or struggling to get control of the car. You can be confident, smooth, and fast on a gamepad, and it's honestly too early to call this, but I definitely do think they'll be competitively viable, which is good for a game like this. And with that, it's time to talk about my experience on a wheel. For this portion of the video, I will be showing some of the footage of me using the driver POV, so you guys can see the wheel animation and everything, but just know that this is not the camera I would actually use with a wheel. That said, first impressions here were unfortunately not great. The default settings, for my wheel anyway, felt super heavy, the force feedback felt like it was constantly clipping, and there was just no detail in the wheel. It was drivable, but certainly not enjoyable, and this made me nervous. Motorsport has to feel good on a wheel, and honestly I was expecting major improvement here, because the jump from Horizon 4 to Horizon 5 was massive, so I felt confident that Motorsport would deliver an improved experience as well. And it does, if you mess with the settings. Now, maybe my wheel specifically just isn't set up well out of the box, but the default experience was not good, and only improved with a lot of tweaks. You can see all my settings here if you're curious, but I definitely still feel like there's some more adjusting to be done. With these settings though, the wheel feels fantastic. Miles better than FM7 ever did, and at its best it does kind of trade some punches with the greats like Assetto Corsa or GT7, which in my opinion has a phenomenal out-of-the-box wheel feel. In Motorsport, you have a great sense for oversteer and can control and manage power slides pretty easily, which is often one of the bigger tells for me. Cornering often feels very stable and controllable, straight line stability feels on point, and bumps and off-track feel are actually much better than expected, especially after knowing that the off-track surfaces were tamed a bit in order to make things easier. Braking also feels fantastic. You can really feel the ABS working or the tires chattering under heavy load. Everything surrounding the brakes felt great. Like I mentioned earlier, you can feel body roll and chassis flex, especially in this Mustang, and it gives you great information about where the car wants to go and needs to be pointed. The two issues where I felt things still needed improvement were in the curbs and the front tire grip detail, both of which might actually relate to the same problem. To speak first on curbs, this one was a bit odd. Some curbs felt great through the wheel, like the stepped curbs especially came through really nicely with that vibration, or if your tire kind of went past a curb and you had to drive back over it, that bumpy feeling came through really well. But specifically on banked or steeper curbs, they just didn't seem to give me enough feedback through the wheel. To explain this better, imagine you're driving up onto a curb at a low speed at kind of an angle. Typically, the wheel is going to pull. You'll feel the suspension compress and jack in different ways to find a resting point. Here's a real-world example of that with me driving a sports car up onto a slanted curb without touching the steering wheel at all, and you can see the wheel move and react to that change in surface angle. Now let's compare that to a very similar situation here at Grand Oak, and as you can see, the wheel isn't really moving much here. Now take a look at this Civic Type R going up a curb in Assetto Corsa. Look at how my wheel moves here. Now, I thought that maybe this was just because the game is simulating stronger power steering or even electric steering, which would heavily dampen this effect, but this is a place where the bright settings should still be able to bring out some more feedback here. And for the record, I did try this on both my settings and the default, just to be sure, and it's the same both ways. This certainly lessened my confidence on steeper curbs because I couldn't really tell what the suspension was doing and where the load was on the car. Driving up on this curb feels no different to driving just on a straight road. I can't even really tell when my tires hit the curb. So it's somewhat minor, there aren't too many situations where this comes into play, and track and car knowledge kind of overcome the lack of confidence there, but I still wish I had a better feeling through the wheel in these situations. Maybe it feels better on nicer wheels or even different cars with stiffer suspension or something, but this was definitely the biggest quirk I noticed. Now, let's talk about my other issue, which I do think might be related to the curbs thing, but is also pretty minor. The cornering feedback still felt a bit more flat than I would have liked, especially with things like elevation change, when the steering might feel lighter or heavier depending on how much load is over the front tires. If a tire caught air over a curb or something, that felt great, but that more subtle elevation change feeling and sense of load on the suspension just wasn't there as much as I would have liked, especially at Kyalami with its elevation changes and the final corner at Mugello. I wish the weight transfer there came through a little better. But there is an exception to this. The Corvette E-Ray I was able to drive for just a lap or so in the intro felt incredible, exactly how I wanted it to feel. So maybe this is just more of a car-specific thing, and better upgrades and tuning combined with some more finely tuned wheel settings can further bring out that feeling I was able to get in the Corvette. I just wish I could have driven it more to get a better feel for the different tracks. Even on corners without elevation change, the starter cars I was able to drive just felt a bit too flat while cornering, and I couldn't really feel those changes in grip and load over the tires during the corner as much as I wanted. They were there, just pretty subtle. So ultimately, with all of this and the curb thing, I think I'm maybe just not getting as much caster feedback as I would like, which is a big element of the feel of a car, and a lot of racing drivers like a strong positive caster feeling because it gives a lot of feedback and confidence at speed. But here's hoping that maybe just the cars I was able to drive the most were outliers here, and more tuning experience and better settings, or even just better cars, can further bring that out for me. Because again, that E-Ray felt unbelievable. Seriously, some of the best wheel driving I've ever experienced. And it's kind of my glimmering hope that these issues I've been talking about are just a car or settings issue. And to be clear before wrapping all this up, these are really just minor nitpicks that I noticed with the cars I was able to drive. It does still feel leagues better than Motorsport 7 ever did. Now, before we move on, while we're still kind of on the topic of wheels, I do want to use this area to discuss the in-race UI, specifically proximity markers. When you play on a wheel, you're going to have a lower spatial awareness than someone who plays on a gamepad in a third-person camera, and that can put you at a pretty serious disadvantage. The proximity markers are better than nothing, and we've had them before, but a real radar would still be so much more preferred here. Even just the ability to zoom in on the minimap so we have a better look at the cars around us at a glance would be a huge advantage. Better awareness makes for cleaner driving, and that should be a top priority for Turn 10, so I'd love to see more customizable UI options here. Now, let's talk about the assists with both gamepad and wheel. For both, I played primarily on sim steering with ABS on and sport traction control. They give you a warning that sim steering is hard on controller and only meant for experts, so I was expecting a Horizon 4 style sim steering mode going into this, where they really do just match your joystick input to the steering angle. but it is actually much more like Horizon 5's, where it does still prevent you from over-rotating too much and it smooths your inputs, which for a controller is good. Next, I do like that we get options for sport, traction, and stability control. I think these could be really helpful for controller players. You know, I and many others were certainly hoping for more step adjustable options per car here, and it's certainly a bummer that these are still not car specific. But having at least a middle ground option between just on and off is nice. We did sort of have this in FM7 with the super easy mode, so in a way this is just a bit of rebranding, but now in Motorsport, assists are actually pretty quick, at least with the cars I was able to drive. Typically in racing games, Forza being one of them, it's fastest to run with most assists off in the majority of cases, and especially things like full traction and stability control can really slow you down. That doesn't seem to be the case so much anymore. I do still expect top players to run with most assists off most of the time, but I absolutely see things like sport traction control being very viable in certain classes, and definitely on a gamepad. I mentioned earlier that the braking feel through a sim rig was really good, and I would absolutely suggest that players on wheels at least try to run without ABS. It's great. I think ABS will still be fast enough for most players, but the feeling you get when you lock up or need to adjust your braking input mid-corner is really good. Finally, for driving assists, we've got the standard auto, manual, and manual with clutch options, but there has been a major change here. You can't really power shift anymore. Now, for players with a shifter and clutch pedal and everything, you won't really notice a difference. It's just like shifting a real car. But for controller players that are used to how Forza used to shift, it's time to try and shake off that muscle memory, or you're going to be grinding gears all the time. You have to now be very deliberate about pressing the clutch, clicking the button for your gear change, giving it a sec, then releasing the clutch. If you try to just tap clutch and shift, you're gonna miss the gear. Overall, I think this is probably going to end up being a good move to help prevent power shift abuse, but I'm not sure on this one yet. I plan to play on a wheel personally anyway, so I'm curious how controller mains will adapt to this change. Now, while we're in the settings, we may as well cover a couple additional options here, which are great, specifically the proximity track limits. You'll have seen these in the footage already, but I really like that you can kind of get the best of both worlds here, where the track limits aren't all over the track all the time, ruining the visuals, but then they pop up when you need to be careful about getting a penalty. And that brings us nicely into our next topic of discussion, Forza's shiny new penalty system. FRR has been completely reworked here, and I think the core of the system is actually very, very good. But I do still think it's going to need some tweaking over time. To start with the good, the game handles situations in which you were pushed off track or crashed into or even just accidentally went off track yourself really well. From my experience, I never felt wrongly penalized. The problem for me was that penalties seemed a bit too soft. There were some spots that I felt I could cut quite a lot without any cars around me, and the game would acknowledge that I went off track, but wouldn't penalize me for it, even though I definitely gained time. Not a big deal, but this is probably going to be a big area top drivers are going to have to spend a lot of time experimenting with, because I could never really hone in on where that penalty line was. It didn't always seem like it was just a 2 tires out rule or anything. Now, the next issue was much more serious: collisions. Let me say first that I think Motorsport might have actually done some interesting work here to try and reduce the amount of force a player receives when hit by another car, and instead transfer those effects more onto the person doing the hitting. It seems subtle, and I want to be hesitant about this and take it with a grain of salt, especially because, of course, I only drove against AI, but in my experience, situations like getting rear-ended when braking into a corner actually didn't seem to push me too much, and instead, when I was doing the rear-ending, it really unsettled my car. This could be, in theory, a cool tweak that will help clean up the driving as a whole and help prevent bad accidents for clean drivers, but I still feel like I could actually hit the AI really hard and still not get a penalty. Watch a few of these clips here, and let me know if you think I should have been penalized for these. So I do think there's definitely more adjusting that needs to be done to this system before release, and it's possible penalties might actually be turned up higher just for multiplayer racing. Now, in most other situations, the penalty system seemed to work just fine. Sideswiping someone or any obviously aggressive action besides the rear ending did give me a penalty, and sometimes a really big one. I even got penalties sometimes for brake checking the AI, which is great. FRR was very good about tracking multiple incidents and ensuring that I knew what I got penalized for and never felt wrongly penalized, but I feel like there is certainly room to abuse how lenient the system can sometimes be. We'll certainly have to wait for the game to launch to get more of a feel on this one, and luckily we know the FRR system is highly adjustable by turn 10. So I think they know they're going to need to tweak things going into this, and if they notice a spot where the system can be abused, it should be easy to just turn a few dials and end up with a lower threshold for a penalty there. Alright, now let's change it up here and talk about the car upgrades and tuning. Lots to cover here. We'll start with the tuning though, and as you can see, most options here are standard Forza tuning options. However, at the back end of the tabs, we do actually get a couple of very interesting new settings. To start, suspension geometry is an all-new window. Here we can adjust the front and rear roll center height, as well as anti-dive and anti-squat. This is awesome to see, and could greatly affect the way we tune cars. These settings play into how effective your aero is, how much camber you need to run, how soft you can run springs along with ride height. It should actually open up a lot of options for dialing in the handling feel of a car, and I'm very excited to play some more with it. Obviously, this is something I'm gonna have to play with a lot before working on a tuning guide and giving any suggestions, and I'm not gonna give anything here based on how limited my experience was, but it's great to see these options here. And there is another that I think wheel users are going to love. We now have car-specific force feedback and steering lock settings. This is fantastic, and something that I will certainly be using a lot as a wheel player. Obviously, this has no effect on controllers, but I have run into issues in games like AC where I need to tune FFB strength per car, and I'm so happy to see that's an option here, alongside steering lock to get faster or slower steering ratios per car. So in all, while the tuning menu doesn't have too many changes, the few that are here are great additions. I also do want to point out that you can see your power to weight ratio now, which is a nice touch. Now let's move over to the upgrades in the new leveling system, which I'm sure all of you are very curious to hear more about. To start though with the upgrades themselves, most of what I saw here was expected. We've got the same engine, suspension, and drivetrain options, and really the only major new part here, which is a good part to have, is the ballast. You've got different weights to work with that are always bringing your car closer to a 50-50 weight distribution. The lightest option will add 2.5% of your car's base weight, then 5%, 7.5%, and so on. And again, this can't be placed, it always works towards centering your car's weight balance. It's not much, but it should open up the door to some more build freedom, which is always good. Now there was one more happy surprise here, and that is the addition and changing of a couple default visual parts. No, the Forza wing is still here, and it's as ugly as ever. But the tow hook on the front bumpers is different and looks way better. There's even apparently multiple options here. We also seemingly get a default rear bumper tow hook option for some cars too, and possibly a default hood pin option. Obviously, I couldn't test this on all the cars in the game, but I'm guessing a lot of cars are going to see these new tow hooks and hood pins, which is actually a nice little surprise. Alright, now it's time to talk about the upgrade and leveling system. I know this is the biggest topic of discussion around the game, and a lot of people are not a big fan. That said, I really wanted to keep an open mind towards the whole thing going into the preview, and just hope that it was one of those things that felt better when you actually experienced it for yourself. For anyone who needs a refresher, this system basically works in two parts. First, all upgrades for your car are locked until you level up the car itself by driving it. The max level is 50, but you unlock almost everything by 35, with engine swaps, body kits, and drivetrain swaps coming in last at levels 40, 45, and 50. The second element to this is the car point system. Instead of using your money or credits or whatever to buy parts, each individual car instead has an amount of available car points to spend based on your car's level. For example, any car at level 1 will give you 300 car points, so you can only throw on maybe 1 or 2 minor upgrades. But at car level 8, you'll have 1500 car points, and can either pick a couple of bigger mods or quite a few smaller ones. The goal of these systems is to create a feeling of bonding with and growing and building each unique car like you would with a real car. It does not feel like that. This system makes no sense. At least with these cars, and I'm assuming for all of them, the level unlocks were all the same. You always unlock things in the exact same order, so you end up having to build every car the same way, just based on what unlocks when. It completely pulls all the freedom out of the upgrade system. For example, when I took the S209 out for my first race, I did some practice laps and ended with a feeling that I really wanted to throw on a front anti-roll bar and play with the diff settings, but those weren't unlocked yet. All I could do was add brakes or an intake, which the car didn't need. Diff settings didn't even unlock for another 2 whole races at level 9, right after adjustable suspension at level 8. Questionable game mechanics aside, this is just so unlike real life. At my first ever real track day, I kept feeling like my car was too tail happy, and I wanted to improve rear grip. So I went and bought some dude's spare wheels that were wider and grippier, mounted them in the back, and went back out and put down the best laps of the day. The car felt way better. I felt the problem and installed the solution. You can't do this in motorsport. The leveled unlocks take away all that personality and freedom of learning a car and then building it how you want based on what you think it needs. So here's how I wish things worked. Locking upgrades behind levels should be gone entirely. You should have access to everything at level 1. Keep the car point system and levels though. This alone isn't bad, and does help add to that incremental upgrade mentality. We should just be able to use our limited car points on whatever we want to. I should be able to use those 300 points at level 1 to purchase a small tire width upgrade, or an exhaust, or better clutch, whatever I think the car needs, not what the game has decided I have unlocked. On top of this, car points absolutely need to carry over to another copy of the same car. It's so silly that it doesn't, and if I'm being honest, I'd actually prefer if instead of a unique individual car level, we should have category or manufacturer levels, with car points linked to that. Driving a touring car should level up all my touring cars, not just the one I'm driving. Even if it's at half or quarter rate with a cap of level 25 or so. Gaining experience in one car should also gain you at least partial experience in another similar car. If I master a Honda Civic, I should be able to hop into a different Civic and not have to start from level 1. That's not how things work in real life. To offer an alternative, maybe even tie minimum car level to driver level. Say each 10 driver levels you gain starts you at 1 level higher for your car level on a new car. So for example, by the time you're level 50, all your cars start at level 5. And then once you kind of get to the end game at driver level 500, all of your cars just have everything unlocked. That way your experience driving in-game makes sense with the leveling system, because simply put, as it is now, it doesn't make sense. Alright, and with that topic covered, I want to switch gears again to discuss graphics and audio and overall game presentation. To start, even though I didn't get to experience all the menus, I do love the new UI. FM7's UI and UX were so bad, and this is a massive step up. The design language is super clear and clean, and I like a more minimalistic look. It's easy to read and understand. The loading screens look really nice. The menus are responsive. Overall, it feels great. For the graphics themselves, again, reminder that I'm on a Series S. I can tell that this game will look incredible on my PC with max settings. The lighting and shadows and overall contrast levels are great. The tracks and environments surrounding them look really well detailed and properly weathered and lived in or driven on. The skyboxes and weathers that I saw were absolutely gorgeous. Forza has always nailed those. And the reflections look really nice on the cars. Across the board, the general game presentation feels very next gen, and I guess you could say the art direction here is really strong. However, on my Series S in performance mode, the rendering resolution and presumably lack of good upscaling really hurt the overall experience. It just looks muddy and low res, and that meant I couldn't really enjoy all the nice details. It did run very smoothly, seemingly always locked right at 60, even with all 24 cars in view, which should be the priority, but that resolution does hurt. There are some other details, like a kinda low LOD distance for trees and low-res shadows, but those are completely fine and expected for the Series S in performance mode. I do hope, though, for people that are going to end up playing this on a Series S, that Turn 10 can end up getting this to maybe run natively at a higher resolution, or just upscale better, because resolution aside, even on the Series S, it does look great. And again, I am confident this is going to look fantastic on my PC. Now, I'm sure everyone wants to hear about the car models in-game, but obviously I was on a Series S and only able to drive 5 cars total that are all newer models. So it's not like I could check out the S15 or the Evo 6 with this terribly modeled exhaust that just hurts me. The newer models look great, and the new paint shaders and how light bounces off the different surfaces looks pretty dang good. Definitely among the best out there, but still not quite as good as GT7. Those car models and paint surfaces are unmatched. So here's what I will say. Dated car models as a whole don't really bother me that much. If you want to reuse old models in order to get more cars in the game, go for it. I'd rather have an outdated car than no car at all. That said, the old Forza models need to be updated better. Glaring issues like these crummy exhausts or completely misaligned details are all over Forza cars, and it's stuff like this that we need to see improvements on as the franchise enters this new era. I'm really okay with them taking the base Evo 6 model and just updating a few things, but leaving obviously outdated or flat out incorrect details doesn't sit well with me when you're trying to brand your game as a fresh start for the next generation that's built to last. I expect this from a game on a 2-year cycle, but it's been 6. And this isn't just Forza Motorsport 8, it's the Forza Motorsport. The standards are higher. Speaking of the cars though, I do have to say that audio has yet again seen another major leap forward. The car sounds both in and out of the car for the 3 vehicles I drove the most were phenomenal. The road noises as well, from the screeching of tires to rumble strips, was a treat. The whole audio experience is really proper, and I'm excited to hear what a lot of the other cars sound like, because just from this little sample, audio across the board was top-notch. It makes me very excited to experience the full game and how different track environments feel through the ambient audio. For example, Kyalami does really feel a lot different than Hakone did, just with the background noise and how the engine sounds bounced off the environment and echoed. It really elevated the experience. And now I want to wrap up this video by talking more generally about things like the Builders Cup campaign structure, and of course the races themselves, and then covering a few more details I missed about other features. So again, we only had access to this one series, the introduction. But this is pretty much how the whole career mode works. You buy a car, or choose one from your garage, then enter a series of themed races, each with their own practice session. It's certainly a fine system, I don't really have any complaints, and I think there will be some really fun series that I'll want to repeat again with new cars, or just to see if I can kind of max everything out. I really don't have too much to say here, besides the fact that it felt fine. It doesn't feel extremely unique or inspired, but it's not boring, and I like the kind of condensed window into a big variety of racing themes. And we do know that we'll get more of these post-launch, possibly in part to show off things like new cars and tracks, and I think that's great. It certainly seems like a solid system, and will likely achieve what Turn 10 had hoped for when building it. I also really like the challenge the grid system in these races, where you can pick where you start in order to adjust your payout. This is a great way to customize your experience. You can actually play more immersively here and place yourself where you would have qualified based on everyone's practice laps, or you can just start at the back with easier AI and have fun passing everyone. It's a smaller feature, but I do really like it. Now, let's talk about the racing itself. It's worth noting that there is still some AI tuning that's being done by Turn 10, so take everything here with a grain of salt. My Horizon 5 preview was the same way, and we were warned that our preview build for Motorsport was a bit dated and that we should expect to see a couple of silly behaviors that are gone now in the newest builds. We were told that the AI now respects your line better and won't just kind of drive into you, and an issue where sometimes they went off track out of corners was also fixed. So if you do see some of those things in the footage, just keep that in mind. That said, the AI from my experience was certainly pretty fast. It is amazing knowing that they don't cheat anymore, and you can actually learn a lot by following the lines of the faster drivers. And the AI does drive each car differently. You'll notice a handling build versus a power build, or how a rear-wheel drive car takes a different line than a front-wheel drive car. They also hold their own positions a lot better, making passes feel more rewarding. In FM7, if you passed or even kind of just got alongside another car, they would just back off and give you the place. But now they don't back off so easily. You have to earn your passes, and they might just be right there to try and pass you back on the next turn. I will say that even at the highest difficulty, the back of the pack still felt too easy to pass. If I started in last, for example, I could easily gain something like 10 to 15 spots in the first lap just by avoiding slowdowns in corners. But for what it's worth, I did qualify well above them in the practice, and the top half of the grid often drove really well. The AI does kind of organically mess up from time to time. Even on the hardest difficulty, some of the mid-pack drivers ended up going wide after a late break, which would give me an easy chance to pass, but the top drivers did not mess around. They also do still handle pack driving better than they used to, and although I did see those moments where they slowed down more than they really needed to if things got a bit too tight, overall, that first lap experience is still improved over previous games. And this is something we know they have the capability to keep improving on as the game progresses. The AI drive a bit stiff, and they don't really react much to your car or have much of a personality, I guess you could say, but they are certainly much more engaging to race with than they ever have been. And this should help the career and any solo racing feel way more fun and rewarding to play. They really aren't just railroaded obstacles along the racing line anymore, and that's a major step up. This is an area, though, where I'm curious to see how well the AI does once players figure out the meta. Because right now, on the hardest difficulty, those top drivers are quick, and again, without cheating, which is awesome. I played most often on the difficulties between 5 and 7 out of 8, and almost always just auto-upgraded my cars without really much tuning, and was able to set practice laps within the top 5 pretty easily, and could certainly hang with them during the race given that I started within the top 10 or so. But when you look at the PI difference between my car and theirs, that's certainly pretty humbling. Now, in this intro series, we never really had to pit or change tires or anything. If anything, it was more about just setting the fuel level for the race and practice. But I will say, just from forcing a pit, the pinning mechanic is actually pretty great. It's a solid animation, you can pick custom fuel levels and repair damage, and there's a whole time mechanic with it that works really well. Again, I didn't get to experience it in a real race setting, but I think people are going to be quite happy with the mechanic as a whole. Not too much else to say here though, based on my limited experience. Finally, we could access photo mode in the preview, and sadly this doesn't have any improvements. We don't even get a lot of the nice new things that Horizon added with its photo mode, so maybe we'll see those post-launch. It was definitely a bummer to not see anything new here, or even the improvements Horizon recently got. And with that, I think I've just about covered everything I experienced in the preview. Wow, this was a way longer video than I thought it'd be, and I know I still forgot some things. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments. I'll be really active in answering whatever I can. And with that, let's wrap up with some final thoughts. Overall, I very much enjoyed my time with this preview. The game looks nice, I'm sure it'll look great on my PC, the handling model is fantastic, and I really just have a couple gripes with the caster and curb feel on wheels. The Builder's Cup format seems safe but enjoyable. The car upgrade system definitely needs work, but there are a couple of nice additions to the tuning and upgrade menus, and the single player racing feels better than it ever has, with some improvements still needed to make drivers at the back faster and not slow down too much in packs. The new FRR has potential, but certainly needs to be refined, and the audio experience is top-notch. There is still so much left that hasn't been experienced here, and really I've just scratched the surface with this preview. But it has certainly solidified my hope that I'd have fun playing this game. It was fun, and there are some massive improvements over Motorsport 7 that really amped up the experience. But I still think Turn 10 really needs to keep a close eye on community feedback and be willing to change, add, and update things based on the player experience. So thank you very much to Turn 10 for giving me this opportunity, really appreciated it, and thank you all for watching. I hope I was able to answer a lot of your questions, and if you have any more, again, feel free to ask. I'll see you soon for more Forza content.